Is morality founded on God? Without God, could any moral truth, could any moral value, could any action actually be objectively correct? Could there be anything that we deem to be moral and it be objectively true? Could it be consistent? Why not be arbitrary if there is not some being which has grounded all moral values to guarantee their truth? On the other hand, if morality is founded by God, might that be circular in some way? Might there be some problem where you run into justifications of morality based on God, and then how do you justify God based on the fact that morality requires it? Those are some questions we'll be dealing with in this video lecture. Specifically, I will be, for most of the video lecture, discussing the book Good God, The Theistic Foundations of Morality, written by David Baggett and Jerry Walls. But what I'm actually going to do is first look at two of the most popular forms of theistic morality. That is the divine command theory and the natural law theory. Then we'll criticize that, and we'll see the account that the authors of this book, Good God, put forward in a way to solve those problems that we will address. And then we'll see the development of their argument and ultimately why it is they argue that the only good reason you have, or at least the strongest lasting reason you have to be good, is if morality is based on God. So, we're going to start with three main arguments. The first, as I mentioned, is divine command theory. This is also known as voluntarism. And it's basically the argument that moral values are dependent on and, importantly, commanded by God. That what is morally good is so because God has commanded it to be so. And that which is bad, then God has commanded such is bad. The next one is known as natural law theory. And this is the argument that moral values exist in accordance with nature, which has been established based on God. So that God has created nature and God has intended things to naturally occur and to end up in a certain state. And that therefore what is good is based on what occurs naturally, what carries out that final end state. So it's a more teleological argument. And then the final argument, which is the one we'll deal with for the rest of this lecture, comes from the authors of this text, and they call it Theistic Activism. So this is where goodness ultimately does depend on God, but it's not dependent on God's commands. And what they want to do is try and combine where, on the one hand, you have the consistency of divine command theory, where God commands something to be good, and it absolutely is good, right? There's no position where you can argue against something being good if it is contrary to what God has commanded. So with this third argument, theistic activism, they want to argue an account of morality which has that, but which doesn't have, as we'll see, the arbitrariness of divine command theory, and instead it can be rooted a bit more in the natural world and the objectivity of the natural world. So we'll see that a bit later. But first, let's start with divine command theory. So the most famous and the strongest argument, arguably, put forward of divine command theory was done by Duns Scotus. So Duns Scotus was a Scottish medieval philosopher who lived from 1266 to 1308. And roughly the version he puts forth is that first, God has a genuinely free will. So God can determine whatever they want to determine. They're not held to certain standards, but instead, whatever God wants to think, whatever God wants to do, God can do with no restraints. Secondly, God has absolute power. So God is omnipotent. And more generally, the understanding of God in not only this account put forward by Duns Scotus, but by the authors of this text as well, is that God is an omni-God. So omnipotent, as I said, all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing, omnibenevolent, all-present, and so on, right? So complete perfection, that all attributes that there could be, positive attributes, God has. Now, with that being the case then, since God has absolute power and God has a genuinely free will, then whatever God commands is morally right. And that is because since God has the ability to command whatever ought to be done, therefore ought to be done, God can do so with whatever it may be. That if God wanted to command that it is morally obligatory that one always cross the road with 2 or 3 people, but never by oneself, then, as arbitrary as that seems, that would be a moral obligation because God has commanded it such, and God has the power to make commands like that, as where humans do not, right? God would have the ability to make universal binding commands. So the upshot of this kind of a theory, as I was mentioning, is that it is absolute. It's very cut and dry what is good and what is bad. There are no exceptions. We'll see the downside in a moment. But next, let's look at natural law theory. So, natural law theory says that right actions are those that accord with natural law, the principles that can be read clearly in the very structure of nature itself, including human nature. So there are many different versions of natural law theory. In fact, to some degree, Aristotle, that we discussed earlier in the semester, his ethics falls under the category of natural law theory to some degree. But we're going to look at Thomas Aquinas's version of natural law theory because, for one, unlike Aristotle, it has theistic grounds, and two, it is the strongest version, arguably, for a theistic version of natural law theory. So St. Thomas Aquinas lived from 1225 to 1274, and Aquinas is famous for bringing back in Aristotle's philosophy. So up until his time, the medieval Christian world thought that Aristotle was incompatible with Christian beliefs and therefore Christian philosophy. And instead, Christian philosophy was largely based on Plato. Aristotle, though, writes the Summa Theologiae and tries to show actually no, Christianity can be grounded on a teleological conception based on Aristotle's philosophy. So the version of natural law theory then we get from St. Thomas Aquinas first says that nature is created by God. That, of course, if you read the Christian Bible, it says God created the entire world, all of existence. Nature, secondly, is teleological, so it's goal-oriented. There is some end which nature naturally moves towards. What it moves towards, then, is the perfection of its being. And so a seed naturally moves towards growing into a tree, and an imperfect seed is incapable of fulfilling that destiny of which is its existence. Thirdly, God has given humans reason. So unlike all other living things in the world, it is human beings which have been given reason. And reason is super important because this allows human beings to read the laws of nature, to see what are the teleological properties which ground all of natural existence. Because human beings can use reason to decipher these natural laws of the world, that means human beings have an ability to understand what things ought to be. Because, take for example, the seed again. a seed ought to become a tree. It ought not become a bear, and it would be imperfect for itself. It would not fulfill its purpose if it does not become a tree. So what that means then is nature reveals how things ought to be. And because humans have reason, we ought then, Aquinas argues, use reason to determine what God has prescribed we ought to do based on the natural world. And that applies, again, not just to when we sometimes separate nature from human beings, it applies to human nature as well. So that means then, whatever seems to be natural for human beings, that is what we ought to do. And we ought not then to do unnatural things. Now, the upshot of this, of course, is that it is something which is grounded in reality, which it seems to be a bit more closer to what you can see and experience as opposed to the divine command theory. Secondly, it also is more objective since it is grounded in reality as opposed to divine command theory, which could be arbitrary. And we'll see why in a moment. So the problem then with divine command theory and natural law theory is presented way back in one of Plato's earliest dialogues, Euthyphro. And this problem becomes known as the Euthyphro Dilemma. And it's roughly stated as this: are morally right actions right because God commands them, as in the case of the divine command theory, or does God command them because they are right? Now, the dilemma stems from this. With divine command theory, if moral actions are right and others wrong because God has commanded them to be right or wrong, then that means ultimately those moral values, those obligations are arbitrary. Because one day God could command that it is your obligation not to murder, and then the next day God could turn around, because God has free will to do this, as we saw Duns Scotus argue, God the next day could determine, actually, we are obligated to murder. And technically, it would be morally correct, that we would be obligated to murder other living beings because God has commanded us to do so. So this then seems to undermine the objectivity. Now, it doesn't undermine, of course, the absoluteness of the commands, but it undermines the objectivity and universality, the consistency of moral commands and ultimately then moral values. Now, the other part of the dilemma then, the second horn here, is that if moral values and commands or obligations are not determined by God's commands, that God commands these things because they are right, so that they are right comes prior to God's commands, then that means ultimately there is some standard which exists above God, prior to God, of which God cannot change. And that would undermine then God's omnipotence. And God could not be a perfect being then. Because if then we want moral consistency and objectivity, then that would seem to be then some, again, standard which God is incapable of changing. And if that's the case, then God has been undermined, ultimately. Now, this comes from Plato because you see in certain dialogues like the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedrus, and others, this idea of the theory of the forms. And this argument that Plato puts forth is that the only things which are ultimately true, which are real, ultimately, are those which are perfect, those which exist in some form which is not corrupted to change. So we saw this earlier in the semester when we discussed Plato. So just a recap of that. Going back to the divided line, right, there are, first you have the world of images, right, with the allegory of the cave, we have the shadows. And of course those images, like let's take a painting of a landscape and finding that painting beautiful. Of course that painting of the landscape is less perfect than the actual landscape as it exists from which the painting is based, because the painting is a representation of that landscape. Well, that we find the landscape beautiful, we only do so because there is some form which is perfect beauty, of which the landscape then is a representation of. And finally, what makes possible perfect beauty is the good itself, ultimate perfection, of which all perfections of beauty and knowledge, truth, wisdom, goodness, and so on, are representations of. And so we get this scale of perfection that goes up to the forms, which are the ultimate perfect models of then those values, those things which are lasting, which are eternal, which are uncorrupted. And so these are things which are independent of any command, right? That for Plato, something is true. It is true independent of any beings commanding it to be independent. And if that is the case, then that would mean that something being true or morally correct is prior to, it's a standard independent of God itself. So we're left with this dilemma then, right? Again, on the one hand, if we want divine command theory, then ultimately moral values are arbitrary. And then if we want objectivity and consistency in moral values, it seems like they would be something which is a standard greater than God itself. Is there any way around this dilemma? Well, this is where the authors of Good God come into play. So again, they put forward this third alternative, which they call Theistic Activism. And it's the argument that goodness ultimately does depend on God, but it's not dependent on God's commands. So they say, it's essentially the view that his creative power is what sustains reality, and that absolutely everything apart from him is dependent on him. So they're going to try and argue that actually goodness is God itself, and that therefore what is commanded to be good is so because it has been brought into being based on God's own being, of which God cannot change, because God is absolute perfection and would not desire to change itself from absolute perfection, because only a perfect being can will such existence. Okay, so first, God and the good. So a mainstream Christian view, and this is the argument, of course, we're looking at more Christian conceptions, but generally they work as well for the Abrahamic religions in general. So a mainstream Christian view is that God and the ultimate good are ontologically inseparable. That what is good is God. God is goodness itself. So what the authors then argue is that the terms being, so saying that something exists, and then ultimate being, so that which has brought into existence everything, which is the source of all being, and then goodness, so what is ultimately the standard of good, of moral value itself, these two terms are the same in reference, differing only in sense. So they say, a thing is perfect of its kind to the extent to which it is fully realized or developed. The extent to which the potentialities definitive of its kind, its specifying potentialities, have been actualized. In acting, a thing aims at being. So what they're getting at is, again, this idea similar to some extent Plato, but then with the teleology of Aristotle. So that what all things aim at is some end. And that end then is the good. That good is not God in that you want to become God. The end is God in that God is the standard of value. And so all the things we do then would be representations of God. So what they're trying to then establish is that since God is an all-perfect being, God then could be the standard of the good. in that its existence is perfection, and perfection being a moral category. Now, that then God is the good. God, being itself a perfect being, is essentially then goodness itself, they argue. They say, yet, since it is God's very nature and no arbitrary decision of his that thus constitutes the standard of morality, only things consonant with God's nature could be morally good. So only those things then, which, like natural law theory, aim at fulfilling the purpose of its existence, could be considered good, in that, again, actualizing their perfection, so the intended purpose of their existence, would then be to achieve for its own separate existence that standard of perfection which God has said is perfection, which is the fulfillment of its purpose. So that would mean then human actions are good insofar as they bear resemblance to the ultimate good, which is God. And that again does not mean then they bear resemblance in that human beings would need to become God, but that human beings would need to fulfill their purpose in the same way that God wills its purpose to be bringing into existence all things in the world with some purpose. And so human beings then would need to fulfill then that purpose to be good. So then, what is the purpose of existence has then been determined by God. So we get then the upshot of natural law theory, and then we'll see in a moment we're working towards then the upshot of divine command theory. Okay. Now, since then we're getting the upshot of natural law theory already, and we have tied then the natural world and purpose, so teleology, then to God, and understanding that we have some purpose which has been set by God itself. What about then any moral obligations, right? There's got to be some moral obligations, of course, like thou shalt not steal, that thou shalt not lie, and things like that. Thou shalt not murder. So goodness and obligation then. The authors want to distinguish the fact that something can be morally good, but not necessarily obligatory. It can be good that I, to fulfill my purpose, don't become lazy and gluttonous. But I'm not necessarily obligated then to work out every day and to eat a bunch of vegetables every day, right? That's not an obligation. So moral duties then are things which are required. These are authoritative. They're prescriptively binding. So they say what we ought to do and that we are bound to do them. We have no choice. They are indications of what we morally ought to do. And if we do not fulfill then these obligations, we are blameworthy. So, there's a difference in sense then of moral obligations, of which though moral goodness is prior to the obligations. And we know then that we've established, according to the authors, moral goodness comes from God, and then now they're going to make the argument for why obligations then being a kind, or being descendants of moral goodness, come ultimately as well from God, but which are not arbitrary. So first they say, moral obligations must be tied to social context. That, again, they need to be rooted in our life, that we see in the same way with natural law theory, that it is tied to the world around us, and we can read it, we can decipher then these laws, and they make sense to us. That they argue it, moral obligations need to be something that one can be motivated to comply with on good grounds that can be publicly inculcated, that we all agree to, that we all can see, that we incorporate into our institutions. They're not things which would clash then with what we need to do to sustain our society. So as the authors say, human social requirements can get us closer to the better reasons for complying on which moral obligation insists. Morally good reasons will arise only from a social bond that is truly good. One's attitude towards community is important, for one is willing to comply not as a means of satisfying a desire to belong, but as an expression of one's sense that one already does belong. Reasons for complying are also affected by our evaluation of the personal characteristics of those who make up the community and our assessment of how the demands serve the community. So then that moral obligations need to have this social context where they make sense to us because they're built into kind of the fabric of our lives. Then, in trying to incorporate into their argument, they need a modified divine command theory then, where blame is given the necessary force it requires for moral actions to be treated with the gravity these moral actions possess. So they say, by offering a convincing account of the nature of obligation, because it is something which is absolute, right? I mean, I don't think there can be anything more clear about why one ought to follow these commands when they are absolute, when there is no, wiggle room. So they say, then, divine command theory easily satisfies the principle that genuine facts of moral obligation should play an essential part in our coming to recognize actions as right and wrong. Finally, divine command theory provides distinctively rich resources for making sense not only of how guilt involves an offense against a person, but also how forgiveness is possible. For the God of Christian theism, for example, is the supreme person who is offended by our moral failure, as well as the one who has provided a way to take our guilt away and restore our broken relationships. So what they are saying then is that God, in being that final judge, right, of which there is no further recourse to some decision that you could go to, God then has the ultimate say in whether or not you have followed moral commands, whether or not you have been a good or a bad person. In that sense, God is the standard then of moral value. Then what divine command theory, if God then commands certain actions like, you should not murder your fellow human beings, then you have a sense of a guarantee, of a consistency that is then not arbitrary, if it is rooted then in the natural world as well. And so would not need to be changed by God itself. So, in their modified version of divine command theory, then, they argue that God does issue moral commands, but these moral commands are consistent with his moral goodness, which is objective and consistent. So they think then they have successfully argued a way around the two horns of the Euthyphro Dilemma, that you can have God command moral goodness, but which moral goodness does not depend on God's commands, but it depends on God's being, of which the commands necessarily come from. And that being is something which is rooted in existence itself, so it gets the good, objective, consistent part of natural law theory then. So God would not ever want to command that one should murder, right? Because that would go against then the perfection of God's existence. And that's not something then which is a standard above God, but it's a standard which is rooted in God's being itself. And so finally, why obey God's commands at all? Well, the authors give us three types of authority. First, there's of course a political or legal type of authority. And this is an authority which has force behind it, of which, of course, if you do not follow it, you can be thrown in jail or ultimately killed. The second kind of authority is intellectual authority. And this would be authority where someone understands a subject better than someone else, and so can determine if something is true or false. Finally, there is moral authority, one who has an upstanding goodness about themselves, of which they are a kind of compass of which one can orient themselves towards. Now, they make sure to mention that if you simply have political legal authority, well, although it might have the force to make people obey itself, it wouldn't have legitimacy. Because just because a law commands that you ought to do something doesn't mean it's ultimately ethical. The difference with God is that God, being an all-perfect being, has all three. God would have the force, the knowledge, and the goodness, of which then one would be obligated to obey the authority of God and ultimately then to follow moral laws. So they say, now then, God has supreme power, knowledge, and goodness, and all of these underwrite his moral authority. He created us and this world and stamped us with his image, and has the power to hold us fully accountable for our actions. Since he has perfect knowledge of us, he understands perfectly what is good for us and our flourishing. Moreover, since he is perfectly good, he desires our well-being and does everything short of overriding our freedom to promote it. In view of his nature as a perfect being, there are no grounds for doubting his authority, because you could not turn to some logical argument, because logic would be based on the being of God, because it would be based on perfection, and God would not be something which would be contradictory. It could not be a moral argument as to why you should not obey God's commands, because God is moral perfection. And of course, God has ultimate power then, of course, to absolve you of your sins, but also punish you for your sins, of which then there is no force you can use to override the will of God then. So I thought for an interesting discussion question, because this was brought up at the end of Hume's An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, where Hume tried to make a secular argument as to why one ought to be good, why one ought to try and follow moral virtues and so on. But what about a more theistic argument? Is the existence of God necessary for there to be an obligation to be good? Could there still be an obligation to be good without the existence of God? Does the existence of God, according to the argument put forth by the authors of this text, does that existence of God make the strongest argument, maybe, for why one is obligated to be good?